Good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And now I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Good evening from Israel. Usually we like to talk about internal, political, partly diplomatic affairs, but really with a focus on what's going on in Israeli politics behind the scenes. Today we're going to obviously, with what's going on in Ukraine, go in a slightly different direction and talk about Israel's place or Israel's role, or how Israel sees the conflict in Ukraine. It's been billed by many commentators in Israel sort of as what are Israel's interests here versus, so it's moral duty. And at the end of the day, Israel does have many interests involved here that other countries wouldn't necessarily. Primarily, it's relating to what's happening on Israel's northeast border over Syria. What's been called the war between campaigns, which is basically, Israel has not officially gone to war with Syria for many years, since 1973, but for quite a while now, for a number of years now, Israel has needed to ensure that the Iranian forces, whether it's directly Iranian forces, whether it's Hezbollah or other proxy groups, do not get a foothold, especially near the Golan, near the Israeli border, and especially Iranian weapons shipments that come in and then make their way across to Hezbollah and Lebanon. Some of these, the equipment that's being sent has allowed Hezbollah to be built up to one of the strongest armies in the world, stronger than most European nations. And Iran has certainly, with the nuclear weapons and as it speeds towards full nuclear weapons potentially capability, it wants to ensure that its reaction forces in Lebanon, and perhaps even in Syria, are fully armed for leverage as a threat to Israel, to ensure that if Israel should ever need to take the daunting but necessary steps to take out the Iranian nuclear program, or at least damage it, that Hezbollah would be able to, really try and gain Israel's attention at such an important stage and really try to inflict a lot of pain on Israel. So what we see in our northern border with Lebanon and Syria, Hezbollah and Iran, is really probably one of Israel's greatest threats, which is touching on the existential threat of the Iranian nuclear umbrella. And for a number of years, ever since Russia basically became the dominant force in Syria, there's been an understanding, what's been called a deconfliction mechanism, which allows Israel to have aircraft sorties over Syria and to bomb what it deems necessary, whether it's military hardware that, as I said, is coming in from Tehran regularly, whether it's Hezbollah fighters who are trying to move equipment across the border to Lebanon. Israel is regularly flying over Syria and basically stopping these possible game changers in its proxy war against Hezbollah. Russia have basically allowed for this to happen. There's a lot of speculation exactly why Russia allows it to happen, probably because while Iran is in Syria and Russia is in Syria, as I said, it's the dominant force, Russia would be quite happy for Iran to leave, but it's not going to openly go into a conflict, so it's happy for Israel to do its dirty work. That's the sort of understanding. As long as Russian troops are not affected, there was, I can't remember exactly when it was, a year or two ago, where some Syrian anti-aircraft missiles in response to an Israeli attack fired on, and I think even destroyed a Russian airplane. And the Russians were very quick to blame Israel for that. So as long as Russians are not injured or harmed or targeted, it allows Israel free space. And as I said, that is not a small thing. This is one of Israel's greatest threats on its northern border. So the Russian element is absolutely important. What we have seen, though, first of all, it should be understood that Israel is playing a very unique role in this conflict. It's probably certainly the only democratic country in the world that has a direct line to both the Ukrainian president and the Russian president. Tonight, remarkably, out of all nations in the world, we saw Prime Minister Naftali Bennett speak to both Zelensky and Putin within 2 hours, relaying messages to each other. It seemed almost absurd weeks ago, and was even mocked by the opposition when the coalition were talking about potentially offering Jerusalem or Israeli mediation between Russia and Ukraine. The opposition in Israel mocked the idea that Naftali Bennett was seen as a serious international player and no one really cared about him, no one really listened to him. Well, certainly that's not proving true, because in the last few days, Bennett has spoken multiple times to both leaders. And while it's clear that it's not necessarily where negotiations are taking place, certain messages are being transmitted. And the fact is that both leaders are ready, willing, and able to speak to him. So there is a unique element to that. Further to these conversations, other world leaders like Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau also called Naftali Bennett, and it's almost certain that he called specifically to find out what was going on, and maybe even to relay messages from the West. So Israel is actually playing quite an outsized role, it seems, at this point. We don't know exactly what was going on in those conversations, but it's clear that that both leaders do find an open ear in Israel. As I said, very few other countries in the world is that happening at the moment. Obviously, President Zelensky is asking for a lot more from Israel. He's asking for greater condemnation of Russia. He's asking for arms from Israel. Israel, at this point, and I think it will probably continue, is not going to give arms. Israel is going to give and has given humanitarian aid, and there's even talk of setting up a field hospital. That would be one of the first in Ukraine itself, and not just on the borders. Israel has set up, medical tents and humanitarian aid on over the border in Poland, in Moldova, and other places. But it can't get involved any more than that. While some countries in Europe have given aid, military aid, mostly defensive, and mostly it's, let's be honest, it's symbolic, because the sort of amounts that have been given are not going to necessarily turn the tide. But it is more symbolic in the fact that Germany, and by the way, the German Chancellor is in Israel at the moment, or at least he was today, has decided for the first time in decades, perhaps even since the end of the Second World War, to actually give arms to a place of conflict. So definitely the rules are changing around us, and Israel has found itself probably in one of the slimmest of tightropes. It's really trying to look after its own interests, which every nation in the world would do, while trying to take the moral, that has a moral duty to stand by the people of Ukraine. Today, we saw something very interesting in the UN. Over the weekend, there was an attempt by the Americans to censure the Russians at the Security Council. And as we know, Russia, like America, has a veto, and it was obvious that the Russians would veto it. But the Americans tried to get signatures from as many countries as possible to back them up. Israel at that point demurred, and as did many other countries. Israel sat back on the excuse that, whether it's true or not, well, it is true, but whether that was an excuse or the reality that Russia would veto it anyway. But today in the General Assembly, Israel joined 140 other nations in condemning Russia. That's quite interesting and significant, because it wasn't a given. There's at least 30 odd countries who abstained, and I believe 5 countries, including Russia, Cuba, North Korea, that voted against. But what is happening in Israel, as we can see, is that there's to a certain extent, a good cop and a neutral cop, let's say. As I said, Naftali Bennett is trying to keep good relations with both. And at the end of the day, Naftali Bennett knows that when this war has finished, and who knows when it will be finished, Israel will still have to deal with Russia on our doorstep, and there will be interests and the security-related arenas that come along with that. On the other hand, we have Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, who's very much taking the sort of good cop. He has, I say the good cop in terms of the West and against Russia. He has actively mentioned Russia in his statements. He has condemned Russian aggression. He has used that language. And he was the one who ordered the Israeli representative at the UN to join those 140 other nations in condemning Russia. So that's, I think, a very careful plan that the two are taking, where one is more open in their condemnation and allowing Israel to take a freer hand in international forum against Russia, whereas Prime Minister Bennett, who again, he has to look at the wider picture, has to understand that, Russia and Vladimir Putin are going to be there after this war. Our problems, Israel's problems with Iran, with Hezbollah and Syria are still going to be there after this war is over. So we have to ensure that at the highest levels that relationship remains intact, as I said, for the safety of Israeli citizens and the security of the state of Israel. While this is all happening, there's obviously there's messages that Russia is sending Israel to keep out. In the lead up to the war, it should be remembered that the defense minister came to Syria, and there was various maneuvers in the Eastern Mediterranean. Some argue that these were a message to Israel to stay out of it because we could make life a lot more difficult for you. The message was received. Also, another area that Israel has to worry about is Russia can and is supplying both Syria and Iran with air defenses, and specifically the S-300s, which continues to be Israel's worst nightmare, especially in Iran, because that could change the calculations and change the game for any Israeli future response if it feels that Iran is on the cusp of nuclear weapons capability. And Russia have agreed to supply both Iran and Syria with advanced weaponry, which would make it far more difficult for Israel to launch bombing raids against either country. And these threats are always hanging over Israel. So again, these are all important elements that Israel has to keep in mind. The final element is what's going on in Vienna, is the JCPOA. Don't forget, the Russians and Americans are sitting together with the British and the French and the Germans are sitting together all on the same side of the table, against Iran, or in negotiations with Iran, returning to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And Russia is a significant player there. It's obviously, as I said in previous webinars, that Russia and China are definitely in the Iranian camp more than the sort of more antagonistic nations in the West. But Russia, as I said, has an open ear to Israel. Israel and Russia have spoken frequently about Iran, not to say that we've necessarily changed opinions with President Putin on Iran, but it's still such a significant arena, the Iranian nuclear weapons issue, that Israel also does have to take that into account. On the other hand, Israel also has to take into account its good relations with the West, and primarily the United States. And Israel did feel a bit of pushback when it did not respond favorably to the US's UN Security Council gambit. But what we are hearing behind the scenes is there is an understanding in the US, and I would probably suggest elsewhere, that they understand Israel's predicament and precarious position here. And to a certain extent, there's even an appreciation that Israel can play a role in perhaps passing messages between the Ukrainian leadership and the Russian leadership. So Israel is really probably, certainly more than any democratic country in the world, and probably more than most around the world, has a very sensitive position. It is trying to, navigate this extremely narrow tightrope that it is walking at the moment. But at the end of the day, it is necessary because, like all nations, it has to look after its own security, safety, and well-being. Just a quick note before we move on about Israeli politics. Again, we've seen a government that is not fully functioning. We've seen other members of the government this week, even today, who have decided not to vote for the government, not to vote with the coalition in the Knesset. Another week, another party has decided to flex its muscles and say it's not getting what it's supposed to, and has taken necessary measures in the Knesset. It's not voting with the coalition. And as we spoke about before, with a one-seat majority, any single person can wreck that. This week or today, we saw Nir Orbach of the Yamina party, who decided not to vote for something, and the law fell. Now we're talking about Meretz's Nitzan Horowitz, who doesn't feel he's getting enough funding for the health ministry, and he's blaming Finance Minister Victor Lehman for that, and he's also threatened to take repercussions within the coalition. And don't forget, there's only one more week until the sort of the spring break, and they're trying very much to get through a lot of these laws, especially ones that they haven't been able to get through in the last few weeks. We did see extraordinary scenes in the Knesset over the last 24 hours. We saw MKs being pulled out of the plenum. We saw MKs tussling with ushers, Knesset ushers who have been instructed by, like in all parliaments, you have the speaker who has the right to remove a member of parliament from the plenum floor, and when they refuse to do so, the ushers have to come in, physically remove them. And we've seen that used quite a lot. We also saw, really members of Knesset really going at each other. The atmosphere is very hostile at the moment between the coalition and the opposition, even to the point where, as I said, the Chancellor of Germany is in the country, and remarkably, the opposition, perhaps it's not remarkable anymore, used that to try and push down one of the coalition's bills. They basically tried to fast track a bill that was going to be voted on, and said that we don't need to hear any of the laws itself. We don't need to discuss any of the differences of opinion on any of the articles within the law, just to get the vote hurried up, because they knew Naftali Bennett was meeting with the Chancellor and couldn't suddenly leave in the middle of a meeting to go vote. So they took advantage of a global event, an international meeting at the highest level, to try and basically scuttle a government bill. And that just shows where we are today in Israeli politics, that even with a world crisis, international diplomacy, one of the major players, the Germans, came to Israel in the middle of it, and the opposition used that as an excuse to try and scuttle one of the coalition's bills. So that's where we are, unfortunately, in Israeli politics. And I am happy now to answer any questions. I would say, before we do go to questions, I'm not an expert on the actual war, so please don't ask me any questions specifically about the war itself, but I'm happy to answer any questions about Israel's role and everything that I spoke about earlier.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much. The first one in from Adam Perry. Can you see Israel enforcing sanctions against Russia to replicate the US and Europe, like banning flights to in Israeli airspace?
Well, thank you. That's my brother's question. So, as I said, it all goes back to what I talked about during the first 10, 15 minutes. And the fact is that Israel has that tightrope. It's very nice for many countries around the world to be able to take this moral stand, and for those nations far outside of the theatre of war, or any theatre of war, like the UK, like the US, like Western Europe, or at least the more southern parts of Western Europe, it doesn't come with too many ramifications. As I said, for Israel, it's part and parcel and connected to what Israel sees as an existential threat. Iranian nuclear weapons, using Hezbollah as a proxy to attack Israel. It has an army stronger than most of Europe, which is being armed regularly, and the fact that Israel needs Russian permission to be able to depreciate those threats is not to be taken lightly. So some of the gestures which the West is taking are very nice, but in reality, Israel's security and the safety of its citizens are certainly primary in Prime Minister Bennett's thinking and the government as a whole.
I have a feeling the answer will be the same to these, but in terms of the financial freezes, would Israel be able to do that? Eric and Anthony Field asked about those.
Again, when we're talking about financial, don't forget there's another important layer to this, which again, Israel is quite unique in the fact that we have a very high percentage of citizens who also are dual citizens of Russia, who have close family, friends, business in Russia, and that has to be taken into account. So, there are many people who want to go back and forth. There are many people who go back and forth, by the way, just like there's lots of Americans living in Israel who travel back and forth for business or familial reasons. So it'd be very difficult to stop flights with Russia because, it's quite simply a civil issue, a civilian issue. And so Israel has to take those factors into consideration when it makes decisions like those.
Understood. So you did just mention the Russian-speaking community, and Peter Chu asks, among the Russian-speaking community in Israel, how much sympathy is there for the Russian invasion of the Ukraine? Is this community influenced by Russian state TV?
Well, first of all, I thank you for phrasing it the way you did, because Russian-speaking Israelis come from Russia, they come from Ukraine, they come from Moldova, they come from Lithuania, Latvia, probably other countries that I haven't thought of. So each one according to where they come from. I was in the Knesset on Monday, and I actually spoke to a few people that I know from different places. And you find it's fascinating for me that you find very different responses. The Ukrainians are obviously with friends, with family, with a certain level of patriotism for their former country, are obviously hard and fast behind Ukraine. The ones who come from Russia, first of all, it's not just about Russian state propaganda if they are watching it, but also they're speaking to family members, and they may be hearing their concerns. They're hearing perhaps a narrative. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but they are hearing a narrative which isn't heard as much in the West. So they are, let's just say, a little bit more sympathetic. Some of them, are no great fans of Vladimir Putin and some of his policies, but they're certainly more sympathetic as a whole to Russia's interest in what they see as its battle against the West and NATO encroachment and breaking the deals, as Vladimir Putin has spoken about many, many times. That one of his reasons for this is the fact that NATO 5 times encroached on areas where it was agreed that they wouldn't, and they feel that having these missiles and missile systems on its doorstep threatens their stability and their security. Again, these are things that I'm hearing. I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying these are some of the things. But I think on the whole that there is a lot of sympathy amongst the Russian-speaking community. We've seen big demonstrations outside the Russian embassy in Tel Aviv. And interestingly enough, obviously I wasn't there, but those who reported on it said it wasn't just Ukrainian Israelis, but also Russian Israelis who were demonstrating as well. Perhaps, in sympathy with some of the Russian dissidents or opponents in Russia who have taken to the streets in recent days and then been arrested. But it's quite a complex community because it's, most Israelis, or most people around the world just think of, them as Russians. There was a joke going around that if President Zelensky made Aliyah because he has a right to as a Jew, he would just be considered another Russian, quote unquote. And in fact, obviously he's not Russian in any way, shape or form. So it actually is giving a bit of color to the community and a greater understanding exactly where they stand. And they're not just all Russians as some. So I appreciate the questioner making that differentiation as Russian speaking as opposed to Russians. So it's quite complex, but I think it's playing itself out in. And also, again, another layer which didn't mention is the fact that, those who are Jewish or have a Jewish parent or Jewish grandparent or who are related to someone who does have the possibility of making Aliyah. And Israel is preparing potentially for thousands or tens of thousands of Ukrainians who want to make Aliyah, or even who want to just come to Israel for a month. There are hotels being emptied out and being given for free for tourists or for potential olim to come to Israel. So Israel is also preparing for that. And obviously it cares very much about the Jewish communities in these places. And also today, when it turned out that there was a rocket fired over the Babin Yar memorial to those who were massacred in the Babin Yar massacre, that also played into it. In fact, President Zelensky wrote a tweet in Hebrew. Obviously, he didn't write it, one of his advisors did, and apparently he has a few Israeli advisors that actually referenced that, and even referenced the motto "Never Again." So it's clear trying to reach not just Israel but the Jewish community as a whole to try and support his efforts fully.
Thank you so much. David Levine asks, what are the chances that Biden will remove his objections to the Israeli Cypriot Greek gas pipeline to Central Europe?
At the moment, not great. It depends. It remains to be seen whether the conflict and what Russia is doing with its pipeline, whether it would, after this, or maybe even during the conflict, whether they'll start looking at to diversify. As I've said in previous webinars, Israel can play a small role. It's not going to obviously be able to see to Europe's energy needs in the way that Russia can. But we haven't heard much about it recently. Obviously, President Biden is otherwise engaged.
Yes, certainly so. Jerry Weiner asks, Iran seems on the brink or close to creating a nuclear weapon. What are the options?
Well, we should differentiate between having a nuclear weapon and having weapons-grade uranium. We've spoken about that also in the past. Iran is very close, weeks, months away from having weapons-grade uranium. That's not the same as having a nuclear weapon, because they also have to be able to fit it to a missile, to test it, etc. And that's probably around 2 years. But having weapons-grade material is arguably a major step, if not the most important step. So that's why Israel sees this time as extremely important. As I said, I think there's very few people around the world who don't understand that Iran is only a few months. Those who are supportive of a return to the JCPOA use that as a justification for speeding up that process. But Israel obviously has other ways of looking at it. But as far as actually having a nuclear weapon, they're probably a couple of years away from that. But certainly every single day they get a little bit closer, and that certainly worries Israel greatly.
Thank you. So while Israel as a country needs to walk a fine diplomatic line with Russia, Carrie Hillebrand asks, have any Israelis answered Ukraine's call for foreign volunteers to join the fight?
Yes. The Ukrainian embassy in Tel Aviv did put out, I believe, like many other places in the world, and I don't know the numbers. I'm not sure if anyone knows the numbers, and certainly it's not something that Israel would admit to, but there are quite a few Israelis in the Ukraine who are fighting there. Some of them are dual citizens, and some of them are Israelis, because the Israeli reporters always seem to be able to find every night in the news different Israelis who are in Ukraine fighting, who have gone there to help in various capacities. As I said, Israel sent out many medical crews as well. But it's clear that there are some. Again, I don't know if it's tens, hundreds. I doubt if it's thousands, but there certainly have been some Israelis who have taken the Ukrainian government up on that.
Thank you so much. And in our last minute here, Peter Chu also followed up on his former question. Has Israel been the target of Russian disinformation and scapegoating in the same way that the US and NATO have been? And if so, can you give an example?
No, it's to the best of my knowledge. Again, I'm not a Russian speaker, so I'm not going to be targeted by Russian language propaganda, but I haven't seen much. Apparently, I mean, there's a lot of stuff on social media. Both sides are trying to put out as much information, stroke disinformation as possible. That's part of modern warfare. That's part of the psychological aspects to modern warfare. But Israel is not seen as an enemy by Russia in the way that NATO is and the West is. So I don't think, with everything has their limits. And when you have limited resources, Israel's certainly not a country of great concern to be seen as, to sort of try and change the minds of the quote unquote enemy. As I said, Israel is playing an outsized role in diplomatic efforts, but Israel with only 9 million people is not going to have a great say on the global opinion stage. So I haven't seen or really heard of anything like that.
Understood. Thank you. All right. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Benjamin Weinthal discussing Germany's increasing support of pro-Iranian regime. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.